Hey, I'm Alec, and today I'm going to show you how to bond your prints together. So a lot of 3D printers have build volumes that are usually smaller than some of the bigger models that you want to print. Whether it's a mini nuke or a jet engine, those are just a little too big to print on most printers. And even if you could, well, sometimes they're not going to turn out too well. Whether it's support on a face that's going to be visible to somebody, so if you had this printed this way, well, now you're going to have supports all over this, and it's not going to be very pretty. So what you can do is you can split up your model into a bunch of smaller pieces and then go about gluing them together. Now there are different ways to glue them together depending on what material you printed it in, and most of them have some level of chemical noxiousness, and you're going to want to be just a little careful with what you're using. But then of course, once you glue them together, you're going to want to find a way to blend them so you don't really see those seams. So I'm going to talk about how to actually attach them and then what you can do after they're attached and make those seams kind of go away. So first off, no matter what you're doing, you're going to want to rough up the surface of the two pieces you're going to adhere together. So if you have two objects, make sure to sand it down, and it doesn't have to be high grit like 40 grit, like 220 is enough. You just want more surface area for your adhesive to bite into. And then you can actually put those together and let it sit and cure, but that's going to give you a much stronger hold than if you tried to glue together a very glossy PLA print. It's just a little too glossy for it to have such a good hold on it. So first off is everyone's favorite super glue. Now it's called cyan or acrylate, but what makes it really versatile is that you can get it in a ton of different viscosities. So whether it's a gel or so thin it's like water, there are a lot of different uses for those. So if you're trying to get glue into very thin parts where you can't get this gel to run, use some of the liquid stuff. And a little goes a long way, because once it goes in there, the surface tension will try and wick it all the way through the seam. So if you're doing something like a mini nuke where this red piece is actually separate than the rest, you have a nice big face to do it on. So you don't have to use something super runny. Whereas in the case with some of this jet engine parts, I needed the runny super glue to get really in there between all the little crevices to kind of keep it all together. So you just want to make sure when you're using super glue that you are mindful of where it's going to go, because once it flows, either you're going to have to sand it off, or if you didn't plan to sand it, well, now you have a big drip running down the side of it. On top of that, it does tend to be harder than the actual plastic. So the more you sand it, the more you're going to wear down the plastic and the less that the super glue is going to wear down. So you'll need to kind of sand down the super glue and then build up the part. Now, depending on what the model actually is, it might be helpful to use a Crafty Pen. So if you take that 3D printing pen and you feed in some filament, the same type that you printed your part in, you can actually use it to physically weld together the two parts in the same material. So if you print together a helmet and you want to print it in a couple pieces because there's no way to fit a head-sized model on a bed, well, you're going to need to put those back together. If you use the Crafty Pen, you can both melt together the two halves and backfill it with more material. And you're not going to see that side of the part, so it doesn't really matter. Now, if it were something like the mini nuke again, all of the faces of this are visible. So if you use the Crafty Pen on this, you'd have to try to find a way to make it just look like natural welding lines or something like that. So with the Crafty Pen, it's really useful as long as it's on the back face of whatever your part is. So JB Weld and 5-minute epoxy are really useful too. Now, both of those do have a cure time, which just means that it's not like super glue where you'll apply it, wait 30 seconds and it's done. It will take some time for it to achieve full strength. So once you apply the two together, you will want to let it sit around for a while, and even the 5-minute epoxy I'd recommend leaving for a couple hours just to give it that time. But I find 5-minute epoxy works really well for me when I have like an armor part that I want to go together. So I use super glue to butt together the two pieces, but then apply 5-minute epoxy along the back. And that just gives it more strength and rigidity, so it's not going to break if I bump into something, and it's just going to give it that much more strength when I'm wearing it. Now, depending on the material, you can also solvent weld it. And that just means the physical material is reactive to a chemical, and so when you apply that chemical, it makes it sort of dissolve. And then you can apply those two surfaces together and they'll meld back into one part. So it's all the same material, there's no adhesive in there, you're just basically melting the faces and making them go back together. That's sort of what we did here with Tracer's gun. So this top piece is vapor smooth, but some of these parts are ABS. So to weld them all together, rather than using super glue, we used a little bit of acetone and mixed with a little bit of ABS, and then we just brushed it between some of the seams, and then we really clamped it together. And then it cured together as one piece. So it's a lot stronger this way than just using regular super glue because it's all the same material at this point. Now this mini nuke was printed in polysmooth, which is PVB and isopropyl alcohol activated. So you could rub a little isopropyl alcohol on both sides and then you could squish them together and it should hold pretty well. And that actually happened with a couple parts where I took them out of the polisher a little too soon and then they welded together as I set them aside. Oops, so reprinted them, but using a solvent is a really strong way to hold two parts together if you can. Now PLA is non-reactive, so you will have to use super glue for that. If you plan to paint your model, there are certain options to blend the seams together. But if you want it to be just the raw printed part, there isn't a lot you can do unless it's solvent reactive, like I said before, and then you can mix up a little bit and try to use it to melt the seams together and sand it back down. But by sanding the part, you're also going to make it stressed, which will cause it to whiten. And so there's just going to be a lot of trial and error and back and forth to get a part to look good and be the original color. But if you're going to paint it anyways, then you can go and use body filler, Bondo, glazing putty, or filler primer to really get that part looking perfect. And that's what I did with the mini nuke. So I did a lot of sanding. I used a little bit of Bondo to patch some of the small parts, but you just mix it as the ratio says on the side of the can and just lightly feather it across the surface, sand it down until the seam's gone, and it'll take a couple tries of building it up and sanding it down and applying a little glazing putty to fill in the little pockets or the very tiny places that don't need a ton of Bondo. It's just a really small divot. But it's a lot of work, and that's where a lot of prop makers and a lot of model finishers spend a lot of their time, because it can get pretty intensive trying to sit there and really get that part looking shiny and glossy, because even a regular 3D print, something like this, you can feel the polygons. But if you tried to blend this and you spent a lot of time on it, you could get it looking awesome. So if you've been 3D printing for a while, a lot of this is going to seem familiar, but I hope that at least one thing in here was new to you. Now, if you feel like there's some technique, adhesive, blending option that I didn't mention here, feel free to leave it in a comment down below. I do a lot of finishing work, so if there's anything new out there that I haven't heard of, I'd love to hear it from you guys. I'm Alex from MatterHackers. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching. If you liked that, subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with all of our videos. And remember, go to MatterHackers.com to shop for everything 3D printing.